Hello, everyone. This is Bob Burris. I'm President and CEO of the Solano EDC. Thank you for joining us today for the latest edition of our series of webinars discussing relevant economic topics in Solano County. We're honored today to have with us Dr. Robert Eiler, a noted professor, author, entrepreneur, and a great partner to the Solano EDC, as well as many other organizations throughout the Bay Area. And today, Dr. Eiler is going to be discussing the Solano County Index of Economic and Community Progress. And this is something that we've partnered with Dr. Eiler and Solano County since 2007. So we're on year 14, I believe. Hopefully I'm correct there. But it's a tremendous document and something that all of our community leaders and business leaders throughout the region and beyond utilize to form policy and decisions and strategies throughout the year to make us a stronger economy. So with that, I want to keep us on schedule, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Eiler to start the presentation. And if you could, go ahead and use the chat box to provide any questions that you have at the end of the presentation, and we'll address as many as we possibly can. But we want to make sure that we keep this within the hour allotted. Thank you all for joining us today. Dr. Eiler?
Thanks, Bob. I'm going to share my screen now. Should be able to see it here in just a second. There we go. Thanks again, folks, for coming today. And as Bob said, if we could just put any questions you have in the chat, and then Bob will monitor those and we will take care of you. So let's get started. If you look at the economic indicators and the things economists are watching, we're watching labor markets very closely. So one of the things, or there's two pieces of that. One is the actual number of jobs that have come back, as well as the evolution of the labor force. So one of the things I'll talk about later when we talk about labor force participation as part of the Index of Economic and Community Progress is what happened in 2020 and what's still lingering in 2021 in terms of the number of people who are either working or looking for work. That's the labor force. We've been watching housing prices. We've been watching commute patterns slowly ascend again, but also thinking about the shifts of where people are working and living, and how long-term that shift is, and what that might mean for local and regional business mix, as well as the number of businesses that will remain in place. A lot of those data have not yet shown their face. They're slowly coming to pass, and a lot of it's also somewhat muted in the short term because of what we saw with respect to fiscal stimulus and the response of both Congress and the Federal Reserve to what happened in early 2020. And if you may have already seen this, that in fact, we've had our recession officially, in a sense, declared over after 2 months, meaning that, and if you've seen past versions of this, I sometimes talk about the idea that we date recessions after the recession has ended. That's exactly what's happened again, but this time the recession supposedly lasted 2 months. I'll talk more about that later as well from a macroeconomic standpoint. Looking ahead, though, we have very good state and national forecasts. While inflation has been rising in the short term, most of those forecasts expect inflation to fade over the next few months, meaning really, I think, the next few quarters. But we're still going to be talking about housing affordability in our local areas, specifically in Solano County. We're going to be talking about drought and how that may affect both agriculture and construction efforts in terms of kind of coming back to the housing market. We're watching fires very closely. We know north of Solano County, in Butte, Plumas County specifically, we've seen a lot of problems here in the early part of summer. We're hoping that we don't have those generalize themselves, but we're watching that closely and hoping for the best for those folks up there. And ultimately, what we have to have is we have to have a full opening of the economy, and that's critical. So as we see this Delta variant run around, and we are concerned about the number of vaccinations, the lack thereof, the way we're interacting in terms of trying to go back to pre-COVID / normal life vis-a-vis the increased threat of the Delta variant, policymakers are going to be using all those data to try to figure out what the next move is. And we're starting to see a small creep, not a gigantic leap again, but a small creep back to something that looks a little bit more restrictive. We will see how general that becomes. But that's something we're watching for in terms of if we don't have full recovery, what workers and residents may be left behind. Here are some late or recent forecast numbers. There's actually some other forecasts that have come up, but the Philadelphia Federal Reserve every quarter does a quarterly survey, of forecasters whose job every quarter and every day of the week is basically to provide a forecast for the American economy. And over the next few quarters, this is the projected growth of gross domestic product for the United States. And so it looks really strong over the next few quarters, and then somewhat moderating at the beginning of 2022, where the unemployment rate, which is the second couplet of data, is also moving down. Now, if you look at these two columns, or these four columns where they're in these sort of couplets, where the first two columns of data are GDP growth and the second two are unemployment, the old forecast, or the so-called previous one, notice the numbers are smaller across the board to the new forecast. So as the first quarter evolved in 2021 and the beginning of the second quarter, these are from May 2021, which I'll now show you. These are the annual data. The old forecasts were upgraded, and that's across the board in the labor markets. And the real interesting part for me as a macroeconomist is the second part, which is the bottom part of the panel, the annual forecast. Through 2024, forecasters looking at everything, including the Delta variant, do not expect another recession, but we expect moderating growth toward the middle of the decade. So big growth in 2021, moderating, unemployment slowly eroding back to its pre-COVID levels, right around 4%. But at the end of 2024, we're really expecting to be back in, let's say, a pre-COVID labor market groove. The big problem, and this is the key, and this is where really forecasters get challenged, is what will be the industrial and jobs mix in 2024 versus pre-COVID, and what workers will be left behind if certain industries do not recover at the speed of others. We might get the same volume of workers, but it might be with a different industrial mix of those workers. The Congressional Budget Office updated their forecast for the US about the same, with slightly less growth in 23, 24, and 25. And a lot of that's in the bold there on the left-hand side because the labor force is forecasted for right now to grow more slowly than it has in the past. Some of that is the continuation of the baby boomers moving into retirement. We also maybe have seen some of that already exacerbated and quickened, if you will, by what happened with COVID. All those data are starting to show their face, but there's really no forecast out there that suggests that inflation is going to remain at relatively high levels going in toward the middle of this decade. A lot of that depends, however, on how our supply chains and our labor markets start reacting to incentives on the demand side and start, in a sense, providing the supply to reduce that inflation pressure. And just as a quick sidebar and a reminder from your basic Econ 101 class, inflation is everywhere a phenomenon of excess demand. So when there are supply constraints and sudden demand based on economic recovery, you're going to have some inflation pressure. This also happened on the heels of the Great Recession. Okay, well, let's now start looking a little bit more focally on Solano County and some comparisons around California. Certainly in 2020, and really the context for this index of economic and community progress is what happened in the previous year. 2019 looked a lot different than 2020, obviously, because we went into recession in 2020, regardless of how short or long it may be. But we saw a large amount of fiscal stimulus come into the county. We saw labor markets start to recover relatively quickly. And this is really a way of thinking about how Solano County has done through the end of June, which are the latest data we have. And as compared to, let's say, the last recession, and really the Great Recession is the best recession to compare to. Don't think about the Great Depression, the 1919 recession, or really any other recession. The Great Recession is the best one because it's the same global, state, regional context, more or less, when this recession began as the last one. The initiation reasons were different, but the basic economic underpinnings were relatively similar. It took about 117 months for the Solano County economy to go from the same volume of workers it had in November 2007 back to that same volume of workers once the Great Recession showed its face and complete. So you can see that slow descension over the first, let's say, couple of years, basically to the end of 2009, then a quick dip, finally hitting bottom sometime at the end of 2010, early 2011, and then on the slow upswing ever since. And a lot of that upswing was catapulted by efforts by the County of Solano, by Solano Economic Development Corporation, which has continued on through past this blue line and into the future. Here's where we are at the end of June 2021 with respect to COVID-19. So we're 94.4% back to where we started in January 2020. with the same volume of workers. And we're watching closely to see that red solid line get past the red dotted line. We need that to happen just to get back to the same volume of workers. But again, the warning is, let's suppose that number, if you see me again in 12 months, is around 100. If it is, what's the industrial mix and how does it really compare to where we were previously? A lot of us as economists are concerned that we will see leisure and hospitality jobs, personal services jobs not recover at the same rate as our higher wage, more educated, more technologically driven workers. And Solano County is a very diverse economy. So that imbalance is something we're watching closely across California and really across the United States. But in local areas like Solano County, it is an important aspect of not only economic progress, but also community progress. Okay, and you can see California here just to show you how general and how Solano County has followed the state in terms of recovery. Getting into more of the index numbers, the original index that was published in May had through the end of 2020. I've added through the end of June here just to give a perspective on the recovery. So you can see that these are the total amount of non-farm employment annualized from 2000 through the end of 2020 and then updated on average through the end of 2021. So you can see the Great Recession very easily here is that first hill and then the drop down into the valley and then that nice growth rate all the way up to 2019, 2020 a hard cut, 2021 starting to pick back up. But we are far away still from getting the same number of so-called non-farm workers in Solano County. The hope is over the next 12 months, we get some really nice growth momentum, both from the macro context, but also from what's happening sort of regionally and locally. And up, we're going to go back to that benchmark number of 143,400. But where we are at the end of June is 135,300. Industrially, looking at the evolution in Solano County in terms of job cuts from January 2020, sort of breaking down that graph we saw before compared to the Great Recession at the industrial level. This is the initial job losses across the major industry sectors in Solano County. And you can see there were some really big cuts. In the information sector, it cut about a quarter of the jobs. Not a huge sector in Solano County, which is inclusive of software development, but also on publishing and a lot of other sort of print-related industries. But it's really the far right-hand side that's the big one, leisure and hospitality and other services, because while construction looks large, the second data installment moving left to right, we're going to see that rebound very quickly. And County of Solano was very smart about making construction a so-called essential business right off the top. And it really helped propel recovery in construction right away. Here's May. You can already see construction jump back up, but leisure and hospitality and those other personal services still kind of lingered around, as well as retail. So now you're going to start to see some real emergence of where the so-called scarring is happening by industry. So that's May. Now, if we jump to December, we start to see recovery generally across most industries. And you can even see retail now has jumped back up above that red line. A lot of that's because we saw some movement of people towards Solano County. When people were traveling, they would travel through Solano County and stop along the way. And as retail remained open, trying to grab whatever revenue they could, we saw at least a little bit of a boost into the Christmas season for employment versus what was true in January 2020, which is good. Now, again, looking at the far right, we still have a lot of job losses on that far right-hand side. Now, getting into 2021, here's April, May, and June. Continued recovery in most industries, the information still kind of lingering around. But what I want to do now is I want to explain what these data really mean. On the right-hand side, leisure and hospitality, that negative 21.7, what that represents is that with respect to the number of jobs that were in bars, restaurants, event centers, hotels, January 2020, by the end of June 2021, 21.7% of the jobs that were there in 2020, January, not there June 2021, about 1/5, a little over 1/5. For other services, hair salons, nail salons, auto shops, nonprofits not affiliated with healthcare, about 15% down. So that's where a lot of the scarring happens. Even though you see information is down 27.3%, the number of employees in that industry versus the other two, leisure and hospitality and other services, are just dwarfed. It's in those two personal services categories where there's a lot of employees and ultimately a lot of potential workforce development work that needs to happen to provide hopefully some more trained people when we see demand start to pick up there. So a lot of that continued lingering low or those continuing cuts in jobs are a function of not quite fully reopening the economy enough, and also some reticence on the part of demand to utilize bars, restaurants, not having events happening, but also going in and getting your hair and your nails done. That's all that stuff is starting to slowly show its face. Okay, so you can see transportation, warehousing, utilities has picked up, has been consistently there. We moved our lives online. That helped a lot. Government helped a lot, just in a sense, keep the bottom from being any deeper. So it's good to give a shout out now to the County of Solano, who not only helped move through the resources alongside of Solano Economic Development Corporation, trying to gain access to as much of those PPP loans as possible. And you can see here that these data are really about the array of industries in Solano County that utilized the PPP loans. There's about 4 million of rental assistance that was provided by the County of Solano through the CARES Act. The PPP loans are still slowly trickling out in terms of their use, but we should also expect there's more funding to come from both the federal government and the state of California's original congressional acts, and the movement of that cash really starts to hit the street. And so as that trickles out, there's still some decent support from the federal government. However, we should expect that as we get closer into 2022, we will not see as robust a set of packages come out specifically for relief. It's going to be more for growth. And the Biden administration has really tried to cheerlead the idea that the original rescue aspects are now starting to end, and we need to think about an expansion piece in terms of fiscal stimulus going forward into the rest of this decade. We'll see how well Congress gets that done. Okay, here is a jobs forecast from Caltrans, and to a certain extent what the California Department of Finance and EDD come up with when they look at the governor's budget, taking COVID into account. So one of the things that's very tricky as a forecaster, as a macroeconomist, is you have to think, when you have this kind of an event take place, how good are the original forecasts you saw maybe even 2 months before the incident? They basically did, you just got to throw a stick of dynamite in them and start all over again. Well, that happened in late 2020. And this is what's looking forward to 2030. So you can see on the top pieces, leisure and hospitality bouncing back strongly, but over a 10-year period. Construction at the bottom, maybe not as much growth toward the end of the decade, because there's going to be some growth at the beginning of the decade. So as that growth fades, it will leave maybe some net negative, at least in the current state. Now, whether that's true or not, some of that could be because you see aging contractors leave the labor force, and just the total capacity of getting construction done will shrink. There may be more automation in construction. That's part of the assumptions here. Agriculture is kind of the same idea, but generally speaking, growth throughout the decade. Now, given how big a calamity the COVID-19 time was in terms of the economy and really in terms of human beings, a lot of these numbers are still a little suspect, in the sense we have some of the dynamics left over from 2020 that still have to play out. But this at least gives you a sense of where forecasters were at the end of 2020, looking forward toward the end of the decade, under the supposition we would see some of those jobs that were lost heavily, as we saw earlier, leisure and hospitality being a big category there, come back over the next few years. This is California in contrast with Solano County. And you can see here for California, some categories like leisure and hospitality, even more growth at the state level than at the county level. But the bottom line is that really, again, here, we're not seeing much on the negative side for the state overall, growth across the board. How good these forecasts are, a lot depends on the next 12 to 18 months in terms of their full emergence from the current situation, which of course, with the Delta variant running around and just a lot of consumer reticence about how much to spend, given the news is not perfectly set against the forecasts, we will see if this continues to show momentum. One industry we're very concerned about for all kinds of reasons, now with drought on top of it, is agriculture. And Solano County has a long history with agriculture and kind of deep roots culturally with it. And now we're on somewhat of a drought watch, at least for this year, hopefully not for the next few years, but we have to think there's always this lag effect in agriculture. So from the Ag Commissioner's Office in Solano County, these are the numbers through the end of 2019, and we showed these in the index. We did not have official numbers when the index went live. So for Solano County, we heard that there were initial estimates for 2020 were down from 2019, but there were already some flattening in 2018 and 2019. Some of that potentially fire related regionally, But the bottom line is we have to watch this for our local farmers. And remember, our local farmers have links to regional food and beverage manufacturing as well. So supporting our farmers has a lot of larger concentric circle support in other industries. Here's California, somewhat similar picture. And I show this as an index where 2009, even though my graph there says 2004, it should have said 2009 equal to 100. If you look at that 100, it's sort of state in Solano County since 2009, it basically climbed up and moved with a similar pattern, especially the last couple of years. What this is really meant to tell you is that we've got to be watching for our farmers and how they link to other industries. Okay, so when we're thinking about how to look forward, Solano County in 2019 had a lot of momentum. So are we going to grab any of that original momentum pre-recession and be able to carry that on forward? Well, we already had a lot of productivity in California, in the US, and in Solano County. The supposition is if we reopen the economy, we should be able to kind of get back to that level of productivity relatively quickly thereafter. Personal income growth has probably helped stabilize things like rental, and also keeping people from immediately selling their homes like we saw in the Great Recession. Equity market stability and amazing growth has also helped that, specifically for homeowners who are also in the equity markets. We had poverty falling and unemployment falling. So we started, for better or for worse, the COVID-19 recession in a relatively good place as a benchmark for where we need to get back to. What you should expect going forward is that we're going to have really nice growth in 2021. So when we look at the index for 2020, we're going to see a lot of problems in 2020, but then backed up by a pretty good year in 2021. It's going to be sort of a smooth ride following what we saw in for the state forecast and for the national forecast going forward. We should assume that the federal stimulus or fiscal stimulus, as the case may be, in terms of rescue, is coming to an end. What kind of chaos, the reduction of unemployment insurance augmentation, the no longer having direct business assistance, having these direct payments to households otherwise not coming anymore, will that lead to some chaos in labor markets, rental markets, housing markets? Somewhat up in the air, but we believe that the worst for now is over. We're going to test that hypothesis as we get closer to fall and winter, and hopefully some flattening of these caseloads and hopefully no restrictive government policies. Okay, let's now shift to the community progress piece. One of the things we saw in 2020 from our demographers in Sacramento about California overall was, generally speaking, across California, dips in population, not everywhere, but I'm going to show you some comparisons that are sort of classic ways we followed in the index for economic and community progress. Here's Solano County. This is the growth from the previous year in terms of population. And you can see that in the dot-com recession time, which is the first installment, these data are annual from 2000 forward to the end of 2020. Population waned, grew a little bit, waned again going into the Great Recession, and then people started to move to Solano County. And this is also as housing units that were left fallow by the Great Recession were starting to fill up and occupancy rates started to rise. You can see that population growth nice and strong over most of the last decade, but then fading toward the end, and in fact going negative with respect to where the demographers in Sacramento have estimated Solano County in 2020, about 0.2% negative. Now, heard a lot of stories about the movement of people, and this is just one of many estimates about the movement of people throughout California. You may have heard that the population increased in Solano County. You may have heard the number of households increase. Department of Finance, as part of the governor's budget process, has estimated that, in fact, Solano County's population has slightly decreased. Well, here's California, and this I think is actually the bigger news, because we've seen the trajectory of Solano County's population in terms of growth slide over the last couple of years, and regionally, as I'll show you in a minute, this is also true. But the state overall losing population, this is one of the very first, or one of the only times in recorded history that California has actually lost population in a year. And a lot of it may be a reflection of rising cost of living, COVID-19 reaction, you name it. But the bottom line is these are the data that have shown their face, and these data are as of June 2021. These are very, very new data. Here's Sacramento. Now, Sacramento has been a real wild positive story through all this. So Sacramento's quote unquote recession in COVID-19 was relatively short-lived in the sense that we saw people moving to Sacramento. These data reflect that. We saw an expansion of the occupancy rates. We saw an expansion of jobs. We saw their labor force remain relatively stable, both because we saw people go back to work, but also inbound residents were working. Sacramento is an amazing place right now in terms of just the growth energy that's there and what's basically, in a sense, potential to become kinetic. The Bay Area has been slipping over many years and went negative as a region. And this is actually Bay Area other, which is the core Bay Area. So think Alameda, Contra Costa, San Francisco, San Mateo counties, where the North Bay, Sonoma, Marin, and Napa have actually been negative for some time. So if you think about Solano County as kind of an amalgam of the Contra Costa and let's say Sacramento County areas, as well as the North Bay areas of Sonoma, Napa, and Marin counties, that's why you're kind of getting this mixed package of population, but also of economic change, because you have this agricultural and manufacturing element against the biotech and other high-end professional services, with all those personal services acting as a foundation for residents. But that North Bay number slipping is concerning in terms of both the reaction to what fires we had in the North Bay in 2017 and how people have looked at living here, but also the rising cost of living otherwise in all three counties together. Okay, so again, these are estimates, not actual head counts. And the policymakers, though, use these all the time. So that's really the key, is that how policymakers are going to react is critical. If we look at the components of what changed population in Solano County, the way that demographers in Sacramento do this is they break it down by births and deaths, or you think of this as the natural increase. And you can see, for better or for worse, births have stabilized while the number of people passing on have increased. This has been true over the last few years. But what's really held up the growth rate of the Solano County population has been the inbound folks from outside the country, as well as inbound folks from inside the United States over the last, let's say, 10 years, but really the last 3 or 4, we've seen that slip. So it was in 2021 where we saw people outbound migrate some other place in the United States. And obviously the inbound from other countries slowed down because of COVID-19 and other economic reasons. But this is that same evolution we saw in the last graph, now showing its so-called components. Now, population and households may have different signs, meaning that if you hear there's household growth, that means there's more occupancy of housing units, but it doesn't mean you get the same number of people. So if you trade a household of 4 people for a household of 3, there's no change to the number of households, but you have population slipping. If you get 2 more households with 1 person each and 1 household that leaves Solano County with 3 people, you have population slip even though occupancy rates rise. So when you mix those 2 together, we need to be cautious to figure out what type of household is being formed. Is it a working family? Is it a senior worker whose kids are gone or maybe never had kids? Is it a person that hasn't had a family yet who is looking to settle down and make roots in Solano County? All those questions are to be answered over the next few years. So be watching for those data over the next couple of months as they start to emerge more completely about 2020, as we get the census data, as we get more refined data from Department of Finance and other forecasters out there in California. Okay, I talked about this earlier. This is the labor force participation rate. Here's the US. So this is a big story when COVID-19 started, that we saw people leaving the labor force for all kinds of different reasons. That's also true in California. That was also true in Solano County. You can see Solano County in 2019, labor force participation was about 63.2%, which means the following. It means for folks that are over the age of 18 that live in Solano County, 63.2% of them had a job or were actively seeking work. That dropped to 61.6 in 2020. Now, it's picked up since then, but since we don't have new population counts, it's hard to sort of reformat what's happening given the increase in labor force that's happened since the end of 2020. But assume that we turned a little bit of a corner. We still have to watch this closely because we're concerned about 2 major items. One, do we have a structural change in the local labor force because people that lived in Solano County pre-COVID have retired, or have maybe stayed home and don't intend to go back to work because of lingering childcare issues, and that will change the way residents interact with labor markets? Or have people left Solano County that were working and traded off for people that intend not to work? That's the game we're playing in terms of how much more local labor availability we see in Solano County versus the region. Okay, so you can see that here, that's the number of percentage points we saw it drop. While California did something very similar, we know people moved around. Now, one of the things about labor force participation is what are you generating locally? So high school graduation rates are one way of thinking about the evolution of local labor force. And Solano County schools look like they're doing very, very well the last few years versus the state average. So higher graduation rates, higher than the state average, cooking right along. On top of that, looking at UC and CSU eligibility, we look at this by race and ethnicity in terms of the index. But in California, we're seeing a little higher rates of college eligibility, a lot of that coming out of our big urban areas. And we're seeing that kind of across the board, except for a few good spots there for Solano County. But this is really not necessarily good or bad. It's just relative to the state average. It just suggests that we're seeing a little bit of difference depending on the race or ethnicity specifically. But I think what's more critical, and this is the key, is that this is the Solano County average. Now, since we've done the index, never has the Solano County average been that close to California. It's basically the same. It's 50.7% of the eligible students that graduate from Solano County high schools are eligible specifically for UC or CSU admission, almost exactly the average across the state. So regardless of what's going on from an ethnicity standpoint, generally speaking, it's about the same amount of production with respect to how graduates are coming out ready to go to college, which is super, super news for Solano County in terms of workforce. Okay, so to wrap up on the data side, and then I'll give you kind of more of a quick summary before we take questions. This is the latest housing market forecast for Solano County that's come out of Zillow's research department. Zillow has hired multiple economists now to do this every single month. Prices are up at the end of 2020 to 491,680. So that was at the end of the year. They were up 7.8%. Now the median price at the end of June is being estimated as 542,595 in Solano County. We know the RENA numbers have come out and suggest there needs to be a pickup of the housing stock. So we will see if that happens. But the forecast for the next 12 months, after very robust growth in 2020 and into 2021, is another 8.5% increase to median home prices to the end of June 2022. So from a housing market standpoint, things are looking really good. What's not looking really good is the affordability of housing if you are not in the housing market yet. So if you're a renter looking to make the jump, credit conditions still remain relatively good with low interest rates. The problem now is the affordability of the remaining housing stock. We got to build some more homes, but we have to do it right with respect to where we see the coming workforce. So when we look forward, inflation looks like it's going to be short term. I didn't show an inflation graph today because we could have done the whole time on the components of inflation, but hopefully, based on forecasts, economic theory, and history, we should see this initial move of inflation up fade as recovery becomes incentives to supply more goods in markets that have right now excess demand and flatten a lot of those price pressures. However, you should expect prices to remain above the inflation rate we saw in the last decade, at least for the short to medium term, because there's probably going to be some general reticence about bringing back workers at the same pre-COVID levels, which is going to reduce the amount of productivity happening. And that's part of the problem right now is we just don't have enough people working yet to deliver supply against the rising demand. Will housing be affected by drought alongside of agriculture, including the higher cost of doing construction? And will that slow down new units? That also feeds into the housing affordability question. Will commuting change? Economists are still waiting, and we're all getting very creative in trying to figure out who's going to get the holy grail of how we measure if people are working from home now, if they're going back to the office. How are we going to see the hybrid work style, and what does that mean for economic and workforce development? There's a lot of ideas running around, but generally speaking, we are waiting to see if we get official data on the movement of people and whether or not we see more people asked to come back to the core urban areas after a lot of hand waving and big statements by CEOs that you can basically work remote forever. Productivity concerns are starting to show their face. The jobs mix, which will come from the three things above and really from economic growth overall, we're going to be watching closely to figure out what employers we lost, what jobs remain in terms of availability, and what workers remain. That means what workforce development needs we're going to have. And folks, at the end of the day, everything I told you is somewhat dependent upon how we get through fall 2021 and winter 2022 with respect to any other variants, including the Delta variant, and how policymakers watch those caseloads and may reinstitute relatively restrictive policies. So be cautious on that. But folks, that's the state of the state as I see it for Solano County, looking both 1 year ago and also what we have as the latest data. Thank you again. And Bob, thank you again for hosting this. I really appreciate it. I want to thank the County of Solano for financing my putting together that index. It should be available at the County of Solano website. So check that out if you want deeper details. And Bob, I'll hand it back to you in terms of asking questions, and I'll come on this slide now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Eiler. Fantastic as always. A great overall presentation and description of what's going on in the economy. We have one question so far, and this is from Vincent Ma of Solano Transportation Authority. If inflation turns out to be long-term, what other options do the feds have for monetary policy? And is the U.S. economy already in a liquidity trap?
Wow, great question. So if inflation remains relatively high, the Federal Reserve will have to make a reckoning with one of two items. Either one, they're going to have to raise interest rates in the hopes that it moves inflation down structurally in the short to medium term, meaning they basically are taking what otherwise might have been 2.5 to 2.75% per annum, increase interest rates in such a way to slow down economic activity and push that inflation rate back down to somewhere like 2.25%, maybe a little closer to 2. They're still stuck on 2%. Bond markets, which normally reflect how medium to longer term inflation expectations are forming, have been wobbling around a little bit higher level than what has been true, let's say the last 12 or 18 months, but have been falling recently, mainly because of inbound funding coming from other countries looking for higher yields. So as the American bond market, specifically government bond market, rises in terms of yield, like let's say go from 1.3% yield to 1.7% yield, it attracts external finance that starts to move that yield down. So if investors were very, very concerned about American inflation eroding the value of those bonds, they might not buy at 1.7%. They may want it to creep up against that increased inflation risk. So for right now, the financial markets are telling us inflation is not that big of a deal. And the Federal Reserve is also signaling it's not that big of a deal short to medium, I should say, to longer term. But what bullets are in the gun for the Federal Reserve? They could do everything but change interest rates, meaning that they could taper back the amount of funding that's out there. They could do more specific credit market purchases to try to increase interest rates indirectly. But after that, they're just basically, they need to be hopeful that all the stimulus is going to lead to incentives for the supply side of the economy to pick up against demand. And what it means ultimately is on the liquidity trap side is if people have cash and they don't want to spend it, and interest rates are in such a way not really giving us an incentive to go out there and borrow and spend, we might get into this sort of savings trap where basically people are so concerned about the future and interest rates are not stimulative enough to really move us off that perceived risk. It's possible. We thought that was true in the last decade, and by the middle part of the decade, we kind of started to walk away from that liquidity trap idea. But it certainly in the beginning of recovery after a really deep recession, regardless of how long we think it lasted, economists are concerned that we're going to see more savings than necessary. The tricky part about that is, and sometimes you call this the paradox of thrift, is that we want people to save, we just don't want them to save too much. Because they save too much, it slows down growth, but we keep preaching save, save, save. Don't just consume us into a problem. Save and let's have longer bouts of growth. And that's exactly what we saw in the last decade. People got a lot better about their balance sheets, and it gave us a really long-term growth pattern upset ultimately by COVID-19.
Yeah, I have a question for you. And this is kind of out of left field. It wasn't a part of your discussion, but it seems like this recent bout of high fuel prices really haven't been discussed thoroughly in the media or in a lot of discussions. But clearly it's got to be a drag on the economy right now. Do you know what the prospects are for fuel prices moving forward? And could that be, if prices come down, could that potentially be another tailwind for the economy?
Well, certainly if fuel prices continue to rise or remain, let's say, larger than they have been recently in inflation adjusted terms, it can easily act as a headwind. Thus, a drop in them should act as a tailwind. Absolutely. And if you are in the fuel commodities markets and thinking about futures, et cetera, this is all for entertainment purposes only. So don't use this as an investment advice. But the one thing about fuel prices that's tricky is we generally don't count fuel prices in the way that we monitor inflation when we think about policy, because we don't like food and energy prices. They're too volatile. So we call the policy price index the core. We get rid of what we think is the most volatile. And in fact, the Federal Reserve now has morphed the core into what it now calls the trimmed core, meaning that even outside of food and energy prices, there's enough volatility. Let's get rid of all that other stuff that's outlier and look just purely at what we think is the most stable, because everything else will kind of come back to the mean, if you will. Fuel prices, however, can be very insidious when they rise because they can start to transmit themselves into other supply chains in terms of rising costs. So the more fossil fuel dependent our supply chains are, the more nasty rising fuel prices are generally across the economy. But if they drop, they have somewhat of an opposite effect, not completely, in the sense that don't think of it as a linear movement. Think of it when prices are rising, it's much more exponential in terms of bad things happening. When fuel prices are falling, it's a little bit flatter in terms of good things happening. It's sort of the nasty part about rising prices is that you get more negative action when they're rising than you get positive action when they're falling. If that helps, Bob, I hope that provides at least an idea. But we should expect fuel prices, especially for the next few months, to remain relatively high because still the demand for gas, as people are getting out of their houses as best they can, is going to remain pretty good.
Fantastic. I'm going to combine the next two questions, first by Daryl Doy, the second by Council Member Ernest from Dixon. So what's your opinion regarding the impact of potential increase in infrastructure spending through the infrastructure bill on the Solano County economy? The second part is, could that massive infusion of investment in infrastructure boost inflation long-term?
That's a great question, or set of questions. So I think the infrastructure bill will positively affect Solano County in two ways. It probably will spill over into transportation projects in some way, shape, or form, whether they be for electric vehicles, for road and bridge repair, for something to have to do with energy otherwise, or potentially broadband infrastructure to reach all points of Solano County more and more completely to, in a sense, reduce inequities that exist with respect to getting on the networks. So I think for Solano County, there should be net positive movements as a result of the infrastructure bill. But to your point, what effect will it have on inflation? A lot of that depends ultimately on the productivity gains we get out of the infrastructure bill with respect to how it changes demand. So if we don't get much in productivity gains, but we spill all this money onto the financial and labor markets, if demand increases as a result of that fiscal spending, it will provide a little bit more fuel to inflation. The hope is we get actually productivity gains out of that infrastructure to walk parallel to the gains in demand to where there's not a lot of excess demand driving more inflation pressure. We will see. But underneath the infrastructure bill is that support for heightened productivity levels to keep supply and demand together.
Thank you. Great question from Bill Busk. Do we have any data yet on permanent business closures in Solano County from January 2020 to present? And then a second part of the question is, what do you see the trends on consumer demand and sales tax revenues for the county or in the city?
Yeah, let me start with the second question because it's a little easier to answer. The latest data on sales tax revenue came out, I think about 2 weeks ago. And comparatively speaking, most counties in California have seen an uptick and in fact are very close to where we were pre-COVID if you're not already above it. So one of the things that's been kind of a saving grace in terms of sales tax revenue is the fact we're taxing internet sales locally where you're delivered. So that's helped boost that, while unfortunately a lot of our brick and mortar retailers, including our restaurants, have seen a sag in taxable sales. So the initial sag has now been picked up as we've reopened the brick and mortar economy and as we still continue to order online and have sales taxes assessed where those packages are delivered. So that's actually been good, and it really is probably a precursor to the idea that we should not expect a gutting of taxable sales unless there is let's say some other change in the economy that is recession-like. Unfortunately, we do not have what I would consider to be robust data on the number of businesses in the industries in which those businesses operate that have closed. And those data, for better or for worse, economists are not very good at tracking that stuff yet. That's another sort of parallel holy grail moment in terms of, we want to know where people have moved, if they have a job, if they're porting their job, how many people came. That's holy grail 1. Holy grail 2 is, can we see through all the clouds and figure out that business closed, that business stayed open, this business is temporarily closed but will reopen. There's too much fuzziness still in the way that which businesses have been assisted, have maybe temporarily closed with the idea that if all the conditions are correct, they will reopen. We should know more in about 12 months. So I don't have a strong answer to your first question. It's the data are still too fuzzy, and whatever you're hearing out there is still very suspect. Unless, again, you're knocking on doors and you're asking everybody and they're giving you a straight answer and that they actually know whether or not they're going to reopen. And folks, let me just say this for the record. Even if they tell you they're going to reopen, whether or not there actually be a going concern 12 or 18 months from now is still an open question.
Okay. And here's a very tough one. Do you foresee decreasing population in the state to be an ongoing trend?
Wow. Well, you guys have softball questions today. Okay, so the population in California, what I'm hoping does not happen is that we don't get census data that refutes the current estimates of Department of Finance, because we all got stirred up about the population loss. If the census come out and says, hey guys, guess what? We in fact had a very small population gain because you didn't count these other people that you should have counted. Under the supposition that all these estimates corroborate each other and we think that California has lost population, we probably will see one more year of it as people are still sorting their economic lives out in the wake of COVID-19. But if you have major employers in California who initially said, live in Boise, live in Des Moines, live in Nashville, live in Charlotte, work for us, do it remote, who are now saying 6 months from now, you're going to have to make a choice. You're either moving back to San Jose or you're not going to get a job, and I'm going to hire somebody who stayed here, because I'm going to need to see your face in the office at least 3 days a week. We're not going to have you come back 5 days or 6. We're going to do 3. But if you're not living in San Jose or its environs, how are you going to pull that off? You're not going to fly in from Nashville, though. Just a sidebar, a few folks probably will in the short term to see if it works, and they'll be willing to finance that because they've got their kids established and their families reestablished. And then there's going to be this big friction that's going to happen. So watch over the next few months whether or not we see that call back to the office, because if we don't, there'll be more downward pressure on the California population because there won't be as much of a need to live here and still generate the gains that come from here. Another sidebar note on that is that you may see California's employers say, okay, no sweat. If you don't want to move back to San Jose, I get it. You found paradise some other place, deal with the snow and the bugs and the sweat, knock yourself out. But guess what? We're going to pay you 3/4 of what we pay you here, because we know the cost of living is about 3/4 of here where you moved. So now you have a choice. You want to come back to San Jose and work in the office 3 days a week, or you want to stay a remote and get 3/4 salary. That's another weird labor market friction on its way, probably for a lot of employers. Because a lot of employers will see that as a way of cutting costs against rising costs otherwise, and forcing the issue with their employees vis-a-vis what they're maybe seeing as potential problems in productivity if folks aren't coming in the office at least a few days a week.
Have there been any good studies on the demographics of those leaving the state? I mean, I know that there is a portion that are remote workers, but I often think that we have seen pretty steady income increases, per capita income increases throughout the state.
Yeah.
Is that because people making lesser income are leaving because they can't afford to be in California? I mean, it would be interesting to see what's happening there.
You know, Bob, it's a great question. It's another one that's very difficult to sort out. Do we know more or less the folks that have left and what they were doing previously? Yeah, sort of, but it's all net. So if 150 restaurant workers leave and move to Nashville, but 130 arrive because they graduated from high school or college and end up in the restaurant business as the beginning, what kind of productivity are you trading for that net negative 15? Hence, maybe you're getting a gain in overall income and spending because those people were not going to spend as much and they left because they'd come to the end of the line. So if you take somebody who's 38 years old with a child and a partner and they move to Nashville and you trade that family for two people that graduated from high school who move into the same apartment and both have jobs in the restaurant world, which household is better? And this is a big social question going forward, because you have some communities who say, I want the working family. You're going to have other communities say, we're struggling just to find workers. So I'm kind of getting more indifferent about the type of worker that's here. I just need bodies. And that sort of back and forth is probably going to get played out in city council and county chambers for the next few years, simply as we're sort of, resetting ourselves, especially in our major urban areas, with respect to the types of households we're forming.
Great. Well, thank you. I
Of
think
course.
that's the last of our questions.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Eiler, for this presentation. Thank you, County of Solano, for sponsoring this study, making this possible for the last 13 years. And any parting words, Dr. Eiler?
Folks, bottom line is this: whatever forecast you're hearing, assume we are going to smoothly get through fall and winter. If we don't get through fall and winter smoothly, it's going to upset a lot of the forecasts. But for right now, we believe that we're going to be able to make the adjustments. Just watch for that, and how much financial market and housing market chaos may or may not come on the heels of that. If we get through fall and winter and we start to get in more of a groove and we all start making adjustments, we should be okay. But that's the one key warning to all the positivity. We've got to get through what was the normal flu season well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Dr. Eiler. And thank you all. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you soon.